This was my contribution to the Mariner's Muse, a part of the Bridport Scallop Fiesta in 2019. The Voyage of the Evangelist, 1879. I was a founding member of the Matsyker Canoe Club, started by Laurie Ford. The aim of the club was to develop skills and equipment that would allow us to do advanced sea kayaking trips to places like Matsyker Island, a remote island off the south coast. It was through the Matsyker Canoe Club I read the story of an incredible journey by canoe in 1879 by the Reverend Fairey. In a small 4-metre wooden clinker-built canoe, his ambition was to visit remote locations around Tasmania's coast to spread the gospel, hold services and baptise children. He called his journey the Voyage of the Evangelist. His canoe had a lug sail, rudder and India rubber airbags for flotation. Ian McDonald and I decided to reenact this journey during the school holidays. We assembled on the Forth River in January 1984 and were cheered off by friends and family, just as the Reverend Fairey was farewelled in January 1879. We paddled down the Forth River, out through the heads and into Bass Strait. With sails up, we cruised along towards Devonport. The Reverend Fairey made it to Wright's Island off Port Sorell and decided to camp. We didn't think much of this campsite, so kept on sailing to Greens Beach further east. On both expeditions we carried similar gear, though Reverend Fairey didn't have plastic. He used India rubber bags to keep his gear dry. His canoe was open to the sea, though it was partly decked. Our sea kayaks were of fiberglass, with front and rear waterproof compartments. Both had sails, though Reverend Fairey's could be reefed. Interestingly, he also had a fuel stove that could heat water faster than our modern transiers. Leaving Wright's Island with a following wind and sea, the Reverend Fairey rounded Badger Head and crossed the mouth of the Tamar River against strong currents. He pulled ashore at the Lowhead Pilot Station and was assisted by the crew to carry his canoe and gear up to the station, where he stayed for the night. During the evening, the small community came to see the canoe and hear his story. Next morning, he was assisted by the local schoolmaster and pupils to carry his canoe and gear to East Beach, where he set off along the coast. As he passed Stony Head, he saw a coastal steamer heading west. The crew came out on deck and gazed in awe at his tiny craft running downwind. As he passed, they took off their hats and gave him a great cheer. About 6 p.m. he came to West Double Sandy Point, where the wind came round and he pulled ashore. On this leg of our journey, we went out to 10th Island to visit the seal colony. Normally seals are quite shy and dive if you point a camera at them when on the surface. However, they love following moving objects, bobbing up and down behind the kayak. This way you can get some good shots of them streaming along. Underwater they are quite inquisitive and come right up to the camera and kayak. Mind you, it's a bit risky going to this island, as it is the known habitat of white pointer sharks, and there has been at least one death here because of sharks. A friend of mine paddling past the island felt a loud thump on his kayak. Thinking it had hit a rock, he pulled ashore and inspected the kayak. He found a shark's tooth embedded in the hull. Next day, Reverend Fairey set off again, but found the wind against him, so he had a hard paddle to get round East Sandy Point. He set up camp again and climbed a nearby sandhill to get a view of Waterhouse Island. He walked to the Little Forester River searching for water, but only found a muddy soak with which to fill his water bottles. Later he noted the wind had swung around again and resolved to paddle at night across to Waterhouse Point, 40 kilometres away. The wind increased considerably as he crossed the bay, and the sea was soon covered in whitecaps. He glimpsed a burning tree on Croppies Point, which acted as a lighthouse. Nearing the point, he was alarmed to see masses of white water and realised just in time he was heading for a reef. Quickly dropping the sail, he negotiated a small gap in the reef and then ran aground on a flat, shallow rock. Pushing himself off, he thought it was time to go ashore, and he pulled his canoe up on a small beach between rocks. He retired to sleep in his kayak, protected by his tent fly. Next morning he awoke to a calm, sunny day and remarked about such a glorious scene. Heading across to Waterhouse Island, he could see a building and small figures moving on the island. Here he met members of the Barrett family. The older man had been on the island for 22 years as a shepherd. They rented the island and ran sheep and a small herd of cattle. Reverend Fairey conducted a short service for the three souls and prayed that God might protect them in this lonely island home. In 1985, I took a party of school students to visit the island, and you could see the many stone walls that the Barretts had built. We weren't as lucky as the Reverend Fairey and were forced to head into Tomahawk to escape a storm. We camped behind the beach, and overnight our kayaks were covered with sand blown by the storm. Not wanting to be delayed too long, we headed out again, and as we neared the Cape, realised that there was still a strong sea running. The Cape was awash with surf, but we pressed on and around to land on a beach in the lee of the Cape. The wind was still increasing, so we decided to explore the ruins of the Foster House and stable along with a 3-hole stone toilet on the Cape. We found an old cemetery on an island in the Tregarron Lagoon, where members of the Groves and Bowen family are buried. Returning, we were amazed to stumble across a substantial stone house occupied by 2 families. They invited us in for a delicious crayfish lunch. It was good to see that the same hospitality that Reverend Fairey enjoyed on his trip was still around over 100 years later. Reverend Fairey had been warned by Mr. Barrett to keep close inshore rounding the Cape, as there were extremely strong tidal currents. After braving wind against tidal waves that kept his deck awash, he came ashore on the island and met the lighthouse superintendent, Mr. Bodenay, and his family. He was invited to hold service in their house. It was 19 years since the last minister, the Reverend Brownrigg, had visited the island. That evening, Eliza Bodenay played the piano, and they sang well-known hymns such as Abide With Me. It was a service he long remembered. He fell asleep to the sounds of the sea just outside his window in Eliza's cottage. When we visited the island, we discovered a headstone that sadly revealed that Eliza had died in 1882, just 3 years after the Reverend's visit. While on Swan Island, Reverend Fairey was asked if he would consider crossing Bank Strait to visit a family on Clark Island, as they were keen to have their children baptised. The Reverend apologised that he had been detained by adverse winds and must press on. This is what he would have experienced if he had agreed. His canoe was certainly seaworthy and he was an experienced sailor, but in a capsize at sea, his canoe would have filled with water, and whereas it wouldn't sink, it would have been difficult to empty, whereas our sea kayaks could easily be righted after a capsize by Eskimo rolling, and we even had electric bilge pumps. Given fresh supplies by the Bodenays, which included a leg of mutton, eggs and loaves of bread, Reverend Fairey left Swan Island and steered for the next point. He declared that he couldn't do justice to the scenery through which he passed, sweeping bays, fantastically shaped rocks and reefs. We enjoyed strong winds that pushed us southwards. At one stage I lost sight of Ian and had to lower my sail and head upwind to find him in the water next to his kayak, trying to pull the mast out of the deck. It had been choked with sand while we were stuck at Tomahawk. With my assistance we removed the mast and he quickly got back into his kayak. This video gives you some idea of just how special this coastline is on a fine day. Passing the Eddiston Lighthouse, we realised that this wasn't there in 1879, as it was erected in 1889. Reverend Fairey camped near Sloop Rock, just north of Binlong Bay, before going into St Helens after crossing the Barway. We didn't go right into St Helens, and the next common stopping place was Falmouth. A similar fate awaited both expeditions here. The Reverend Fairey wanted to land here and meet Mr Steele, a friend of his church congregation. In approaching the beach, he was caught by a series of greenback waves that capsized him, snapped his mast off, and losing many of the items below decks, including his binoculars, provisions, and worse, his boots. Friends on shore helped him drag his canoe ashore and rescued some of his clothing and boxes that were floating in the surf. Ian McDonald suffered a similar fate, capsizing and breaking his paddle and losing the items in his cockpit. Fortunately, his important items were safe in the watertight compartments. Seymour on Long Point, near Bicheno, was our next stopping place. There used to be a small township and jetty for shipping coal. On the beach for a mid-morning break, we met a man who was interested in our journey, and we told him about the Reverend Fairey. He invited us to his nearby shack for another crayfish lunch, and in conversation realised he was my boss in the Education Department. He was Dick James, Northern Regional Superintendent. I later sent him a copy of the Voyage of the Evangelist. The Reverend Fairey was stormbound here, and he eventually had to hire a bullocks and driver to cart his canoe and gear across the Malting Lagoon, which allowed sheltered access to Swansea. We, on the other hand, headed south along the Freycinet Peninsula and around to Swansea. The next objective was to get into the safety of Blackman's Bay over the Barway at the entrance. Reverend Fairey experienced huge swells as he negotiated Mercury Passage. Noting that the waves were so large, he lost sight of the tops of mountains on Maria Island. Arriving at the entrance late in the afternoon, he was dismayed to find the Barway covered in white water and impossible to cross. Instead, he kept offshore and slept in his canoe all night, waiting for the swells to abate. Next morning, and it was still rough, so he had to head further south and land at Lagoon Bay. He had been in his canoe for 25 hours. Studying his map, he realised he could portage his canoe and gear across to Blackman's Bay. He split up his gear and made several trips, taking all day. As night fell, he became disorientated, losing some of his gear and desperate for water. Late at night, he wandered around, eventually seeing a light through the trees. Reaching a low building set in the bush, he knocked on the door and was ushered into a dimly lit room where he met Mr. and Mrs. Allison. Mr. Allison remarked, "You must be the gentleman who is journeying along the coast by canoe." This was amazing, since it was well before mobile phones and even telephones. After drinking 5 large cups of tea, he settled down to sleep. Reverend Fairey spent a few days recovering before he was helped to carry his canoe and gear across to Blackman's Bay. We were lucky, as the Barway was open and we camped inside Blackman's Bay and visited the monument erected to commemorate the visit of Tasman in 1642. However, just south of here, on another trip, we also experienced the full might of an unpredictable sea. Soon things really start to get hectic in the narrow channel. At one stage, I was sure Mick was going to go clean over the top of us on a breaking wave. Fortunately for us, he capsized.
Are we mad?
I gave a copy of this video to Mick, who wisely didn't show his mother for quite some time.
Back her up, mate, back her up.
The difficult part of the expedition was now over, since we were in calm waters. The Reverend Fairey sailed up to present-day Denali and had assistance in carrying his canoe across to Norfolk Bay because there was no canal. Similarly, when reaching Lauderdale, he had help in portaging across to Ralph's Bay. Then he was in the Derwent and sailed up to Constitution Dock in Hobart. We sailed through Denali Canal, camped on Sloping Island, and then sailed around South Arm up to Hobart, where we sneakily camped on the beach at Sandy Bay. We had learned a lot about ourselves and developed a healthy respect for the sea, but also admired the tenacity and determination of the Reverend Fairey, who had completed the same journey solo over 100 years before. Since that trip, I have paddled extensively around Tasmania, and in places as varied as Lord Howe Island, the Whitsundays, and even looked for mermaids on Kangaroo Island. Overseas trips have included paddling around active volcanoes in the Mediterranean and along the coast of Mexico. In 2001, we paddled across Bass Strait. But in finishing, I would like to give you an insight into two very special places. The first is here in Tasmania, Albatross Island on the northwest coast. The second is my paddle in Tonga. Sea kayaking has allowed me to enjoy many of our planet's environments. My relationship with the sea continues to evolve, particularly since the development of new technology. Who's to say where this might lead? An underwater drone?